This evening, I'm going to present the Natural History Museum, or NHM. I'll use the abbreviation NHM. It's a project of the Brooklyn-based activist art collective Not an Alternative. The NHM repurposes the generic form of the Natural History Museum as a set of institutionalized expectations that transmit collective power. Using the legitimating aesthetics of natural history museums, the NHM forwards a divisive political perspective on science, nature, and capitalism. Typically, the institution of the Natural History Museum presents itself as committed to authoritative neutrality. In contrast, the NHM project politicizes the institution, dividing it from within. Anyone tasked with science communication has to take a stand. Do they stand with collectivity and the common, or with fossil fuels, capitalism, and oligarchs? Through the NHM, cultural institutions such as science and natural history museums appear as divided and contested sites both of complicity and of emergent counterpower. So tonight, I'm going to set out the NHM project and draw out the lessons that its view from the side has for politics in the Anthropocene. So I'll begin with some background on the artists, Not an Alternative. Not an Alternative's name is a twist on Margaret Thatcher's infamous "There is no alternative." The name shifts the emphasis in Thatcher's phrase, positioning itself as necessary, as that which is not an alternative in or to our present system. Not an Alternative's projects aim to find and occupy the impossible instances of a given system, splitting the system by forcing its internal limits back onto it and seizing the common egalitarian potential that is already present. Not an Alternative developed its position via a critique of the injunction to participate that infuses the contemporary intertwining of capitalism and democracy. Socially engaged artists often repeat communicative capitalism's demand for participation as if participation were in and of itself a radical act. Not an Alternative rejects this. It emphasizes that networked media involves us in building the traps that ensnare us. Communicative capitalism appropriates anything new that we create. Capitalist institutions use radical projects to build their own brand identities. Producing the new feeds the system. In the name of democratic participation, artists and activists end up reinforcing dominant processes of multiplication and diffusion. The group explains, as Not an Alternative, we are not interested in the production of solutions or the inclusion of new subjectivities or symbols, but rather in the excavation and occupation of existing ones, revealing an inerrant split. Not an Alternative breaks with socially engaged art in that it views politics antagonistically. Political art should occupy division and force the institution to take a side. Not an Alternative's work takes the form of installations. This past spring, it exhibited with Project Row Houses in Houston. It also does interventions in arts institutions and public spaces and political collaborations. Its collaborations have been with community groups like Occupy Sandy and Picture the Homeless, which is a housing advocacy group in New York, activist campaigns like Strike Debt, and social movements like Occupy Wall Street or anti-foreclosure and climate justice movements. Its work is characterized by a militant uniformity. Instead of looking for the new, it seizes the generic, whatever symbolizes some minimal degree of institutionality in the context of uncertain meaning and the decline of symbolic efficiency. For example, Not an Alternative came up with Occupy's black and yellow symbolic infrastructure. During Occupy, the militant uniformity of the yellow and black helped make a collective subject present to itself, enabling it to feel itself as a collective force. And of course now the color scheme has been taken up in movements beyond Occupy. So in contrast with the familiar critique of representation, Not an Alternative demonstrates the power of representation. Today, many activists, artists, and theorists reject representation for its inevitable omissions. But this rejection is anchored in the fantasy of a pure, complete, and direct representation. Not an Alternative accepts that representations attempt to produce their subjects. A shared image or point of identification, a name in common, affects those who identify it as a marker of collectivity, whether they identify with it as their own or see it as designating an enemy. During Occupy, it pulled out a visual element of the movement, tents, forcing acknowledgement of the way tents already functioned as clear symbols of occupation. Because of Occupy, tents assumed a political meaning that had remained implicit in their range of appearings in refugee camps and the temporary encampments that sprung up outside US cities during the economic downturn. Whether or not every occupier was actually living in a tent, that didn't matter. What mattered was that tents signified occupation, pressing the divisive claim of the people against the 1%. Not an Alternative's militants, that's those ones that they're carrying there that say Occupy to Liberate. These militants carried in actions and attached to walls even after police had cleared all the occupiers out of Zuccotti Park. These militants pointed to the fundamental division in capitalism that Occupy asserted and highlighted the symbolic infrastructure that the movement itself was producing. Okay, so this is the Not an Alternative. This is the group now who is behind this Natural History Museum project that I'm going to present right after I get a drink of water. The NHM was launched to coincide with the People's Climate March in September of 2014. And it launched with an exhibition and a 2-month-long discussion series in the New York City building at the Queens Museum. The exhibition featured a 64-foot tent set up inside the building. Inside the tent were a series of light boxes with photographs of dioramas from various other natural history museums. Taking place inside the tent, the discussion series included artists, writers, and activists organized in panels on institutional critique, the Anthropocene, museum patronage, urban planning, and climate justice. The enormous tent gave the feeling of both an exhibition and an expedition. It resonated with Occupy, linking the occupation of the Queens Museum to the political movement and making the Natural History Museum legible as a political form for climate change struggle. There are natural history museums all over the world, a pre-existing infrastructure ready to be activated against those who would use it to legitimate fossil fuel production and capitalist-oriented science. The NHM's tent divides the space of its installation within itself. Turning visitors into occupiers, it creates a new divisive collectivity. Under the same tent, visitors become part of a collective splitting the museum between the people and the corporation, oligarchy, or industry seeking to present knowledge in its interest. The NHM is a dues-paying member of the American Alliance of Museums, AAM. It has a board that includes prominent scientists like James Powell, artists Mark Dion, and environmental activists Naomi Klein. Less than 6 months after the NHM's launch, its director was invited to serve as a guest author on the American Alliance of Museums blog. On the American Alliance of Museums blog, yeah. So the NHM doesn't exist as a building, it has a bus, and it uses the bus for expeditions to sites such as Sunset Park, Brooklyn, which is an area inside New York City's storm surge zone. It's taken an exhibition to the 11 oil wells in the Big Cypress National Reserve in the Florida swampland, and to Washington, D.C. for the delivery of a petition with over 400,000 signatories demanding that the Smithsonian Institute remove billionaire David Koch from its board. The Natural History Museum also sponsors investigative, toxic tours like Operation Dinosaur, carried out last spring in Houston. Operation Dinosaur was a collaboration with Tejas, an environmental justice group, and scientists from Texas Southern University. The study placed air quality monitors on plastic dinosaurs in neighborhoods abutting the world's largest petrochemical hub. At the Museum Expo, accompanying the American Association of Museums 2015 annual meeting, the NHM had the largest exhibition space. So this means a small group of Brooklyn artists calling themselves the Natural History Museum had an exhibition space bigger than the Smithsonian Institute's exhibition space. It brought its bus and enormous tent into the Georgia World Congress Center in Atlanta, where it highlighted fossil fuel industry greenwashing in science and natural history museums. Volunteers from the NHM distributed flyers to visitors with answers to questions commonly posed to museum professionals trying to navigate through the funding pressures of neoliberal capitalism and the ideology of authoritative neutrality in the context of climate change. One of the largest installations the NHM included under its tent was a recreation of the famous polar bear diorama from New York's American Museum of Natural History's 2009 climate change exhibition. The NHM version included previously excluded political economic content regarding David Koch, who at the time was a member of the board of the American Museum of Natural History. Where the original diorama featured a polar bear confronting the detritus of consumerism, the NHM diorama exposed what lies beneath the surface, a large oil pipe from Koch Industries. The NHM pushes to the surface the infrastructure that the American Museum of Natural History would prefer to keep submerged, namely, the fossil fuel industry driving climate change also supports the American Museum of Natural History. That's David Koch there. The NHM functions then as a campaign and a counter-institution. As a political campaign, it challenges the fossil fuel industry. It provides a platform for calls for fossil fuel divestment, a vehicle for organizing scientists and museum professionals. The NHM targets cultural institutions that communicate knowledge of science and nature, museums that retain a great deal of public trust, but which provide legitimating opportunities for coal, oil, and gas companies. Fossil fuel oligarchs like David Koch sit on the boards of and are major donors to such influential museums in the US as the American Museum of Natural History in New York and the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. The dinosaur wing in the American Museum of Natural History, for example, is named after Koch, who donated $20 million to the museum. To combat this oligarchic influence, the NHM organizes scientists, museum workers, and museum visitors to stand with and for the common over and against capitalist extraction, exploitation, and expropriation. In March of 2015, the NHM released an open letter signed by dozens of the world's top scientists, including several Nobel laureates. The letter urged museums to cut all ties with the fossil fuel industry. After its release, hundreds of scientists added their names. News of this letter went viral, appearing on the front pages of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, and featured in The Guardian, Forbes, Salon, Huffington Post, and elsewhere. Later that summer, the NHM's bus operated as a platform for speakers, delivering a petition with over 400,000 signatories demanding that the Smithsonian remove Koch from their board. By the end of the summer, it was clear that the NHM was having an impact. The California Academy of Scientists, the California Academy of Sciences, one of the science institutions specifically targeted in a joint initiative of the NHM and 350.org, the California Academy of Sciences announced that it was phasing out investments in and relations with the fossil fuel sector. A few months afterward, Koch himself stepped down from his spot on the board of the American Museum of Natural History. Now, a spokesperson from the museum said that the campaign against Koch, quote, absolutely did not factor in his decision. But the media all covered it as if it was an activist victory, so it was. More recently, the NHM organized another letter. Over 1,200 archaeologists, museum workers, anthropologists, and historians expressed their solidarity with the Standing Rock Sioux against the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline. The pipeline threatens Sioux water, violates their tribal sovereignty, and designates their sacred sites and desecrates their sacred sites and burial grounds. According to Robert Janeway, a leading editor of a journal on museum management and curation, what was overwhelming about this support from museum practitioners is that they're normally conservative and neutral when it comes to societal issues. Janeway continues, we are witnessing the emergence of a new level of mindfulness among these professionals, a mindfulness grounded in both social justice and climate justice. Tactically then, as a campaign and a counter-institution, the NHM expands who acts and why. It has seized an institutional site that claims neutrality, organizing those within it as a political force. To sum up, the NHM operates along three axes. It is first a platform for political organizing that recognizes that science communication is a site of struggle. The NHM turns the ostensibly neutral zone of the museum into a politicized base camp, its visitors and workers into cadre combating the fossil fuel sector at the heart of the capitalist economy. As a platform, the NHM moves beyond participatory art's valuation of participation for its own sake. It works instead as an organizing tool for building divisive political power. Second, the NHM is an artistic project that confiscates the form of the Natural History Museum in order to direct us toward what the museum as an institution excludes, namely, the place of power and politics in determining how we see and what is possible. This place is our place, the real of class struggle in a setting where the dominance of the capitalist class stands in the way of a coordinated, collective, and egalitarian response to climate change. Third, the NHM is a theoretical laboratory for experiments in politics in the Anthropocene. I'm going to develop this last point. The challenge of politics in the Anthropocene is a matter of perspective. We can't look at climate change directly. We look for patterns and estimate probabilities, relying on multiple disparate measurements. We see in parts the melting ice caps, glaciers, and permafrost, the advancing deserts and diminishing coral reefs, the disappearing coastlines and the migrating species. Evidence becomes a matter of extremes, as extremes themselves become evidence of an encroaching catastrophe that has already happened. The accumulation of atmospheric CO2, the highest recorded temperatures, the hockey stick of predicted warming, sea level rise, and extinction. Once we see it, the it of climate change encapsulated into data point or disastrous image, it's too late. For what and for whom remains unsaid, unknowable. Approached head-on, climate change appears as unprecedented, unthinkable catastrophe. To this disaster, capitalists respond with business as usual, maybe even better, a set of new opportunities for wild technologies of geoengineering or super cities for the mega rich. Incapacitated by magnitude, boggled by scale, the left gets off on moralism, we told you so, and overemphasizes complexity. Rejecting human agency, it fails to pursue possibilities of a collective action thereby protecting the capitalist class it should oppose. Too much of the contemporary left manifests a diminished capacity for imagining human subjectivity. Even as things, objects, actants, and the non-human engage in a wide variety of lively pursuits, humans seem confined to roles of observers, victims, and survivors. Observers are the scientists, their own depression and loss, now itself a subgenre of climate writing. Scientists measure and track, but can't do anything about the unfolding catastrophe. Action is for others. Observers also appear as the rest of us, as moral audience, enjoined to awareness of human, non-human entanglements and the agency of microbes. Our awareness is, for some, an opportunity for spiritual development, or maybe for this possible spontaneous convergence of multiple instances of individuated moral and aesthetic appreciation of fragility. When the scale is anthropocenic, the details of political organization fall away in favor of the plurality of self-organizing systems. The second role, victims, points to islanders and refugees, those left with nothing but their own mobility. They are again shorn of political subjectivity, dwarfed by myriad other extinctions, and reduced to their equivalence with so much lively matter. The third role is as survivors. Survivors are the heroes of popular culture's dystopic futures, the exceptional and strong concentrations of singular capacity that continue the frontier and entrepreneurial individualism that the United States uses to deny collective responsibility for inequality. If fascination with climate change's anthropocenic knot of catastrophe, condemnation, and paralysis lures some on the left into the loop of capitalist enjoyment, an anamorphic gaze can help dislodge it. Anamorphosis designates an image or object that seems distorted when we look at it head on, but that appears clearly from another perspective, right? And this famous example is Hans Holbein's painting The Ambassadors. Lacan emphasizes that anamorphosis demonstrates how the space of vision isn't reducible to map space. It includes the point from which we see. Space can be distorted depending on how we look at it. Apprehending what is significant, then, may require escaping the fascination of the picture by adopting another perspective, a partisan perspective. From this partisan perspective, the whole will not appear as a whole, it will appear with a whole. The perspective from which the whole appears is that of the subject, that is, of the gap that a shift to a partisan perspective opens up. When we try to grasp climate change directly, we end up confused, entrapped in distortions that fuel the reciprocal fantasies of planetary scale geoengineering and post-civilizational neo-primitivism. The immensity of the calamity of the changing climate, with attendant desertification, ocean acidification, and species loss, seemingly force us into seeing all or nothing. If we don't grasp the issue in its enormity, we miss it entirely. But when we approach climate change indirectly, from the side, other openings, political openings, become visible. Rather than trapped by our fascination with an always illusory anthropocenic whole, we cut across and through. We gain possibilities for collective action and strategic engagement. The NHM adopts a view from the side. It enacts a partisan perspective. In contrast with left anthropocenic enjoyment of failure, moralism, and catastrophe, the NHM creates new collectivities, expanding who acts and why. Scientists appear as more than observers. They become active cadre fighting for the common. The political capacity of the museum form itself takes shape as a counterpower, a weapon that the many can deploy against the few. So I'm going to conclude by drawing some lessons for politics in the Anthropocene that we learn from the NHM. Most broadly put, these are lessons in institutionality that hold open the role of institutions in collective struggle. And I've got 4 headings for these: collectivity, division, infrastructure, and truth. Collectivity. The premise of the NHM as an organizing platform is that institutions matter as combined and intensified expressions of power. More than just the aggregation of individuals, they are individuals plus the force of their aggregation. Because institutions remain concentrations of authority that can be salvaged and put to use, it makes political sense to occupy rather than ignore or abandon them. We can repurpose trusted or taken for granted forms. Natural history and science museums are interesting sites for political seizure and occupation. They retain public confidence as vehicles for science education, but at the same time they're threatened by budget cuts and market imperatives. So typically they are nonprofit, donor, and grant-dependent organizations focused on cultural rather than commodity production. Yet, they are forced to compete for visitors in the dense marketplace of entertainment. This subjects their staffs and boards to pressure. How do they retain their commitment to truth and the collective good in the face of opposing political and economic demands? The NHM makes this split within museums explicit, and it uses it to organize museum workers, scientists, and visitors. Right? That's what it's been doing with these sign-on letters and petitions. Aggregated through the NHM, previously disconnected scientists present themselves as a collective force against the fossil fuel sector, and they are a collective force. Some museums reinforce individualist and individualizing expectations. They conceive exhibitions in terms of individual affective response. They model displays on the basis of individual use of screens and information acquisition. They attend to individual consumption opportunities, like souvenirs. They aim to produce enthusiastic subjects for neoliberalism, subjects who admire innovation and fail to think politically. In contrast, the NHM produces collectivity. The problems of capitalism and climate change are our problems, political problems where neutrality is not an option. Second thing, division. The NHM mobilizes division in 2 ways. First, as I mentioned, scientists and museums tend to think they have to be neutral. The NHM confronts this by pointing out the limits, pointing out the claim's own limits in the purpose of the museum. As asserted in the Code of Ethics for Museums, the museum is responsible for fostering an informed appreciation of the rich and diverse world we have inherited. It is obligated to preserve this inheritance for posterity, providing a common resource for humankind. So, to that end, natural history museums must not generate legitimacy for those who would undermine the possibility of a future. They have to take a side. The second way the NHM mobilizes division comes from its conception of nature. Some view nature in terms of the privilege of the few who can own it or the few who can access it. Others view nature in terms of all of us, a balanced whole, as if we were not divided in our relation to nature, as if nature were not violent, ruptured, and cataclysmic. The NHM takes its orientation to nature from the insight that nature is common and what is common is divided. We struggle over what is common. We fight to keep it common. The fact of this struggle alerts us to division, conflict, and antagonism. Nature has never been in balance. Division goes all the way down. Third, infrastructure. The NHM is the generic form of the Natural History Museum present in any natural history museum. It takes hold of the collectivity that is already present as institutionality and redirects it against that which exploits it. Just as the museum is a site in the infrastructure of capitalist class power, right, with its donors and galas and named halls, so can it be a medium in the production of a counterpower infrastructure that challenges, shames, and dismantles the very class and sector that would use what is common for private benefit. Since the 19th century, robber barons, financiers, oil magnates, and fossil fuel oligarchs have weaponized cultural institutions, presenting exploitation, hierarchy, and dispossession as if they were natural. The NHM refuses to cede the cultural commons to the capitalist class. Cultural knowledges, symbols, images, and practices are social products, not property belonging to the 1%. Rather than overburdening ourselves with the overwhelming task of inventing entirely new political and social forms, the task is to fight on, through, and for the terrain of the common. So the aesthetics of the NHM is more than relational, it's political. The intent is not to create a transformational experience or new appreciation of community, it's to achieve concrete political goals. Divestment from fossil fuels, organization of scientists into a divisive collective, appropriation of the museum form in climate change struggle, seizure of institutions of knowledge production and cultural transmission, and building a counterpower infrastructure. So the NHM doesn't promote awareness and debate, it pushes collective will formation. And it does so by giving a name and a form to such a divisive will. Fourth, truth. The NHM states that its mission is to affirm the truth of science. By looking at the presentation of natural history, the museum demonstrates principles fundamental to scientific inquiry, principles such as the commonality of knowledge and the unavoidability of the unknown. This mission is a generic statement of the fact that the credibility of museums of natural history comes from their fidelity to truth. Truth is partisan. It's not a matter of consensus. Scientific truth forces itself beyond and through the practices and intentions of those who labor in its name. It's not identical with what scientists do, and it's not reducible to its instrumentalization by capitalism and the state. In the theoretical language of not an alternative, science is not identical with itself. It is pushed and shaped by the real of a truth exterior to it, a truth to which it is faithful. T.J. Demos notes the dilemma that climate denialism poses for environmental activists. When we appeal to scientific expertise, we defer responsibility, giving up science to the dominance of states and capitals able to fund and deploy it. When we resist scientific expertise, we begin the slide into an inadvertent alliance with climate denialism, with the eco-thugs of extractive industry who spend billions to protect their interests by any means necessary. Demos argues, facing this dilemma, one must be aware of the fact that whatever we know about the environment, we owe to the diverse practices that represent it. The NHM locates itself at the site of these representational practices. Its wager is that insofar as science is shaped by a truth exterior to it, science can't itself communicate its partisanship. Even as scientists pursue and defend findings and methods as if their life depended on it, they tend to support a view of scientific practice as neutral and objective. Critics of corporate-funded science, industry-funded science, state-funded science, racist science, sexist science, and colonialist and imperialist science rightly and repeatedly demonstrate the falsity of this claim. All these particular enactments of scientific practice propel themselves by enclosing what is common within the limits enabling the practice. The practice of science is configured by its settings to which it contributes, but the truth of science is not the same as the practice of science. To affirm this truth is to force a gap within scientific practice, making science the truth of a subject. So, to conclude, the NHM demonstrates how institutions are forms of collectivity that matter and that can be seized. Their missions, styles, structures, and personnel. Their very form can be conscripted into a service that they may not know that they support. The perspective of the Natural History Museum, as with any institution, is collective. The challenge is for whom? For capital or for partisans in organized political struggle? The NHM arranges collectivity, division, infrastructure, and truth so as to cut through the paralysis of ecological apocalypticism. As an activist platform, it does the work of political organization. It doesn't get lost in cynicism, failure, melancholia, or the endless circuit of critique. It doesn't aim to democratize or pluralize. It doesn't aim to activate passive spectators, but rather to organize active scientists and museum workers. The NHM enables them to take the side they are already on, as it mobilizes natural history museums as politicized camps in a class war against the fossil fuel sector at the heart of the capitalist system. Targeting the institution, it salvages a pre-existing language and infrastructure, claiming it as a common resource. It thereby provides an experiment in seizing the state that can and must be replicated.